Hi, hello, salut, bonjour. I hope you're doing very well from wherever you're watching at this moment. As usual, I'm glad to connect with you, even though I feel under the weather, but the urgency of the moment requires me to come on and connect with you as we continue to shed light as to what's happening in Cameroon at this moment, especially following the presidential elections that took place on October 12, 2025. And as you know, up until now, we still don't have the results because the Constitutional Council has pushed its date, postponed the proclamation of the result for the winner of these elections to Monday, October 27. And I know people have called to ask the question, are they within the 15-day limit? Yes, they are, because the law stipulates in Article Section 137 of the Electoral Code, the Constitutional Council shall adopt and proclaim the results of these elections no later than 15 days or within 15 days after the polls close. And that is your key statement, after the close of the polls. The polls close at 6 p.m. So, which means that by 6 p.m. on Monday, October 27, if the Constitutional Council hasn't yet finalized and read a winner, then they would have been breaking the law and outside of the law, whereas they are the body that is in charge, the supreme body, the top body in the country, whose word is final. There is no appeal after the Constitutional Council. So that's just to take that out of the way. But most importantly, we begin on a very sad note, and that is the death of a primary school teacher in Garoua. She becomes the first casualty of this post-electoral storm. And that is a very bitter pill to swallow for a family. And so it explains the angst that you have with the people in Garoua following this tragic incident, because it is alleged that a police opened fire and a stray bullet picked this woman in her neighborhood, and which was so uncalled for. And we sympathize and continue to share concern. And on another tragic note, you must have heard of the kidnapping and killing of a member of parliament in Ako Messager by the name of Abe Michael. All these incidents are very sad. His death is being attributed to separatist fighters, which goes to tell you that the 2016 crisis that ensued, again, under similar circumstances as we are today, we are still finding it hard to deal with the casualties and the death that have occurred in many families. These tragic incidents just go to confirm that power struggles have human faces. And when you look across the country, a slew of communiques and orders coming from senior divisional officers and DOs, ministers calling for peace, championing peace. And therefore, we want to probe as to what does it mean? What is the meaning of this peace that is being clamored across the country on the eve of the proclamation of the results of these presidential elections? When you hear the ban on motorbikes in Benue in Garoua, there's a curfew between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. in an area where motorbike riding is the best means of transportation, given the poor road infrastructure that has been the situation for over the decades in this part of the country. What do we expect? How do you expect these motorbike riders? Some of them are first degree holders. How do you expect them to feed their families? Why the tension under a climate that was supposed to be peaceful if the elections were free, fair, and transparent? In Douala, the SDO of the Vuri division, same thing, giving warnings and issuing communiques banning all form of public gathering. And again, issuing the same ban for motorbikes not to go into certain areas of the town after 6 p.m. You look at the streets, places are quiet and calm. In the Menua, it's the same thing. Communiques issuing warnings, especially when you know that the CPDM office there was torched following protests, again because of electoral malpractice. And on top of all of this, we have reports of school closures where students have been sent home and told not to return until after the results. Which again begs the question, why was there not official communication from the get-go? If the Constitutional Council knew that it was going to proclaim the results on Monday, then this information should have been made public earlier on in the week. But again, it came late in the evening after they wrapped up their activities with the petitions, which may make sense on one hand, but on the other hand, the bans that are coming out from these different senior divisional officers, it goes in the contrary direction. Because how do you expect citizens to plan ahead of something that disrupts their livelihood? So at this point, many citizens are wondering, observers, critics alike are so concerned that are we in a state of emergency? But again, one continues to wonder, what is the level of consultation that is taking place in order to arrive at these decisions that are disrupting public life? Observers have decried this situation, calling it unbearable, because for many motorbike riders, this is their only source of livelihood. When they are being banned to operate, especially in the wee hours and hours where some of them are able to catch up with lost productivity. Because again, when you think about it, this situation should never have been so had there been good governance to give them jobs. Some of them are degree holders, engineers, technicians, highly qualified, but they have no option but to resort to motorbike riding. And when a few days go by without them working, some of them cannot even make ends meet because this is towards the end of the month. And while those that are in big offices are getting paid and have their fat checks and salaries to go with and even stuff themselves and prepare should any crisis erupt on Monday, they are ready because it's the end of the month. What about the motorbike riders that depend on every single day's check or payment in order to survive? And that is what is worrying across the board. So you add on top of that the continuous tension across the country where leaders are going to their communities. They've been instructed, as they say, to go into their communities and continue to preach for peace, targeting certain youth, asking them to stay at home, giving them warnings. Why all these warnings if this election is free, fair, and transparent? It begs the question, why the heavy militarization across the country? If this result is supposed to be something that was obvious, if the people voted for the candidate that will be proclaimed in their overwhelming majority, you may just be wondering if this is peace, because it looks more like panic disguised as order. And that explains why Tchiroma Bakary, in a recent statement, came out clearly and declared that he has been talking to leaders of neighboring countries. And the statement is clear that no one is going to come and fight for Cameroonians, that Cameroonians will have to fight for themselves, which again tells you that the people are sovereign, so they have to take ownership. And it makes sense because if someone was going to come and help Cameroonians, they would have started so in 2016 when the Anglophone crisis erupted. We know that villages were torched, hundreds and thousands of people killed, and yet nobody came from outside to make sure that those that perpetrated these acts were held accountable. Cameroonians in these regions were abandoned and left to themselves. The evidence is there based on all kinds of Human Rights Watch reports, and that is very sad. And this time around, just for the proclamation of results, there is already this heavy mobilization. One does not know what the future holds after this. And if all of this is not enough to get you wondering, we have just received confirmation that Tchiroma Bakary has issued a statement indicating that he's been reliably informed as of October 23rd, 2025, that there is a squad preparing, heavily militarized, and ready to take him out. If these threats on Tchiroma Bakary's life were ever to be executed, that would paint a very sad picture for Cameroon's democratic story and leave an indelible mark in the minds of those that have hope for change. Because how would you expect us to believe that someone who once said, I'm quoting the incumbent, President Biya, he once said long ago in an interview that he would love to be remembered as someone who brought prosperity and democracy to Cameroon. And here we are, at the last days of his 43-year mandate. We are seeing despicable things and hearing horrifying stories. And might I add that in 2015, if you would recall, during a press conference when François Hollande visited Cameroon, during a state dinner, and a French journalist asked President Biya at the time, reminding him that he had been in office since 1982 and he had gone on to win all these different elections. and that there's an election coming on the horizon in 2018. For him to have been in power for that long, does he plan to retire or to continue his mandate and continue to serve another term? And to that, President Biya replied, "Ne dis pas au pouvoir qui veut, mais qui peut." And if we can attempt a translation, we would say, no one stays in power because they want to, but because they can. And therefore, those two quotes alone explain to you the gap between promise and practice. Because can is not a democratic word. It's a word for control. And control is what happens when power becomes afraid of change. So how did we get here? Well, if you don't mind, let me take you down memory lane for a little bit. You would recall in 2008, when the supermajority ruling CPDM party in the National Assembly decided to use their supermajority of over 150 parliamentarians to abolish presidential term limits. That singular act is what critics have called the original sin in Cameroon's modern politics. Of course, the SDF walked out in protest because they couldn't do anything. And that has been the story of Cameroon's parliament, because they don't have a strong opposition that can change the course of different bills. And in this case, a particular lever that was meant to protect democracy was open. That door, ever since it was open, paved the way for what we are seeing today. Because without that singular act, President Biya would have ended his term in 2011. And who knows, maybe by today, Cameroon would have known one or two more presidents and seen different styles of governance, which could have brought some meaningful change. And therefore, it tells you why we are where we are today. And might I highlight the fact that 2008 didn't go down easy, because it was a bloody moment in Cameroon history. So many people lost their lives on the River Vuri Bridge because they were out in protest. Although official records would tell you that these protests were later called les émeutes de la faim, as if it was a hunger strike, whereas the statistics, the raw data, shows otherwise. Because at the time, there was a hike in fuel prices. You had the different trade unions of taxi drivers who had already submitted their declaration to protest and to go on strike. You remember Edith Kawala, this very brave woman, she mobilized so many Cameroonians to give them civic education on the electoral process and to understand what this means for democracy. Civil societies in Cameroon worked hard, but all their work fell on deaf ears. Or at least one can say that because it did not yield the fruits that they had expected. Because this singular act did not just abolish presidential term limits, it also gave the president unlimited powers. And that explains why, after that period, every decision that came down and even the style of governance could indicate that there was a heavy centralization of power in Yaoundé. And you would remember the famous expression, les apprentis sorciers, where President Biya, upon return into the country, addressed the nation and, in the same fashion, as usual, brushed off everything. The protests that took place, the people that died, the unfortunate business, the situations, the businesses that were destroyed, because Cameroonians were fed up. Price hikes here and there. And on top of that, no glimmer of hope on the horizon. And this is a stark reminder to all those parliamentarians who are still in office and who remember the role they played during this 2008 constitutional amendment. Because when you change the law to serve one man, you steal the future of millions. And you see why the political blunders of the past continue to haunt the country. And I think that is why the youth have said enough is enough, and they are ready to go to any length to defend their vote and make their voices heard. As we see protests erupting everywhere in the country and people chanting Issa Tchiroma Bakary, Notre Président. And as we've said before, those critics who say Issa Tchiroma Bakary is not the ideal candidate may just have it wrong because the people see it otherwise. Because how would you explain that a party like the SDF that has been working so hard to take power has just been declining election by election, especially since the departure of late Nijon Fundi? PSRN is the same thing. A young, vibrant person like Cabral Libi was not able to mobilize the entire country to rally behind him because at some point, the politics of divide and rule took precedence. But why did Issa Tchiroma Bakary succeed to rally the entire country and have votes across a cross-section, even right into the military? It's because there comes a point in time in the history of a country when the spirit of change overwhelms a person and they have to carry that torch irrespective of their past. And when the people see that light, they answer the call and follow, regardless of their fears. Because when we hear eminent professors come out to criticize Issa Tchiroma Bakary, one is left to wonder, couldn't that energy be used in transforming the raw materials in the country? Couldn't that energy be used in devising ways and means to apply technology to give the youth more jobs? Couldn't that energy be used to transform the different parts of the society in the educational sector that he is managing, especially higher education? Do you know the amount of graduates that go through university without ever seeing the four walls of a proper lab? They learn things in theory, but do not know how things work in reality because their universities don't have labs. And here we have an eminent professor who is supposed to be concentrating his energy and effort to tackle such issues, more concerned with a presidential candidate. Whether or not they declare themselves president élu doesn't matter. Because the fact that Issa Tchiroma Bakary declared himself a winner doesn't change what the Constitutional Council will proclaim on Monday. Because anybody can say they are a winner. In what way did they break the law? So why the commotion? Why the panic? Why the tension? Everyone should just wait for Monday. Because like we've discussed before, the role of the Constitutional Council is to adopt and proclaim the results. They could have heard all those hearings, and as you saw them, Patricia Tomano Damjoya is the only lady that stood there, brave woman. She stood there and kept hearing irrecevable, inadmissible, whatever terminology, all those things she knew because it has become commonplace. And that is why critics and observers are pointing to those kinds of incidents to say the institutions are tampering with their own credibility when they don't listen to petitions or address them in a manner that reflects the spirit of the law. But that tells you one important thing. If the Constitutional Council rejected all petitions, that called for the annulment of the entire elections, then the Constitutional Council is left with only one option: proclaim the result of the elections and call a winner. So adopt and proclaim. That's what the Constitutional Council will do on Monday. There is nothing else that can be done up until this moment. But the delay tactics of postponing that proclamation up until Monday is what has left pundits and, again, critics to wonder. But it's all because probably they are listening to all of this, they are watching and observing. Will they decide to make a change? Who knows? And that is why you hear observers on one side say this regime is known to always go all the way and never stop. When they set their mind to something, that is which they're going to do. On the other side, you have optimists who are seeing the glass half full and say they are just hopeful that on Monday, maybe the Constitutional Council postpone the proclamation of results in order to buy time to make some strategic changes that would appease the people when they proclaim the winner. And before we wrap up, may I also mention that Congressman from Illinois, Jonathan Jackson, issued a press release in which he acknowledges the situation in Cameroon and is calling on all the powers that be to respect the democratic will of the people and to uphold the rule of law, and which goes in favor of Tchiroma Bakary, because sometimes diplomats in this context, congressmen, don't talk in all the same terms that you hear in the media when pundits and panelists express their opinion. They choose their words carefully, but when you read in between the line, you can tell that diplomats across the world and other heads of state are paying particular attention as to what's going on in Cameroon. And it's not for nothing that when you hear accusations leveled against Tchiroma Bakary from within the Yaoundé regime, accusations of manipulation of facts, manipulation of procès-verbaux, incitement of violence, and so on, it's all because those are tactics to discredit his person. Because if Tchiroma Bakary has broken the law, then let the judiciary take its responsibility. It's not up to politicians to go on different media platforms or issue lengthy letters insulting or calling names. It is for the judiciary to take its full course. The same way we would have expected the judiciary to take its full course when electoral malpractices were captured on video and plastered all over the internet. Because in a functioning democracy, those are crimes that are supposed to be punishable by law. And nobody needs to petition the courts to take action. The courts can take action by themselves, because the crown, or in cases where you have the state lawyers, the attorney generals, they have the authority to take charge and protect democracy and protect the rule of law. So no, political parties don't need to point out, because the evidence is overwhelming. And therefore, forces of law and order that work under the purview of the judiciary should be able to enforce the law in instances, because up until now, Electoral hasn't said anything about these irregularities and gross disregard of the electoral code and all these levels of fraud and malpractices that was caught on video. Now you only hear on the other side people complaining that, oh, these videos were doctored, it's artificial intelligence, those pages were doctored, they are full of errors. If they are full of errors, where are the original pages from Elecam published for everybody to see according to section 113? That is what the people want to see, because the famous expression is "Où sont les PV?" Why do you need to ask a political party to provide result sheets when there's an electoral body that's independent, that is supposed to oversee elections, and which the law even guarantees that only the procès-verbal from Elections Cameroon is admissible in the court of law or before the Constitutional Council? And may I take this moment to highlight the fact that when the National Commission for Final Counting wrapped up its work, it is during that process that we started seeing leaked results, right? Because these leaked results, unfortunately, is what has caused the life of this parliamentarian in a messager. Because had those results not been leaked, folks would not have known that the commission was tabulating information about the Northwest and Southwest region that showed higher voter turnout than the population that actually live in these regions. So that is what called people's attention. And it's in the same way that Tchiroma Bakary knew that the commission was counting results that showed him at around 35% and giving the incumbent, President Paul Biya, around 53%. So at this juncture, it's important to make an appeal to the powers that be. If they want to be remembered as peace builders, then they have to prove it. Because you can't be banning motorbike activity, militarizing the city, asking people to stay at home, sending leaders, parents, community activists to go and champion for peace, whereas people can't feed their families because their source of livelihood has been affected. In a country that does not have reliable public transportation for everybody, and that does not have social services that can feed the people while they wait for these results to be proclaimed. So there has to be some solution. Before you ask people to go stay at home, you have to make sure they are fed and well taken care of. We even hear of internet dropouts in many places. We just hope that there is no tactic to censor communication, because that's a fundamental human right. Because when we hear reports that all the different big telecom companies are dropping out of their networks is very unstable. It can only remind us of history because it happened before. During the Anglophone crisis, we do remember. Because it will be unconscionable to censor communication at such a critical time in the life of the country. The whole world is already watching. Many African countries are eager to know what's going to come out of all of this. Cameroon, in some settings, is becoming a laughingstock because there are so many things that are happening that defy the norm, that just make people scratch their head endlessly. And to the youth, you know your place, you know your rights, you know the power you have. It's your future that is at stake. And your continued vigilance in patience is not weakness, it is strength. You've always been told that you are the future of the nation. Today I tell you that is a fallacy, because you are the present and this is your moment. You've done your duty, your civic duty. You've exercised your rights. And to respect the motto of the country, peace, work, fatherland, that is your inheritance. You are sovereign. Article 2 of the Constitution, the people shall be sovereign. Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the people must have their voice heard through free, fair, transparent elections. And that is how they choose their leaders. And they have a right to participate in public office and public governance. And this is exactly what is happening. So come Monday, October 27, 2025, history would be written, and you would have written that history because the power is in your hands, and that is your birthright. And on to the next one. God bless Cameroon.